It's really good to be back here for our last session on evil and suffering. This is perhaps one of the densest topics we'll be talking about this series. We talked previously about how it is to live a Christian life, how it is that we can know God exists, and how does Christianity stand out. The question of evil and suffering is a bit different. It's a very personal, a very existential question about how do we reconcile the existence of what seems to be great difficulties and challenges in our life with the all-loving God. And this has been discussed in various ways throughout history. It's been discussed from the perspective of theoretical philosophy about whether it's even logically consistent between God's existence and evil. But it's also been discussed from the perspective of a pastoral question. How did the early Christians approach evil? How did our experience with evil shape our understanding of God? And you notice that this is a very broad question, and I'll only try to perhaps introduce you to a few of the main areas of this debate in the theoretical side, but more importantly from a Christian perspective. We'll be looking at the book of Job, which I think is arguably one of the most Christian books in the Bible. Not to say any of the other books are less Christian than the book of Job, but it is to say that I think in the Old Testament very few books wrestle with Christianity and the challenges of Christianity as strongly as the book of Job, and we'll be touching on that a lot before we then, of course, touch on some of the theoretical debates and theoretical discussions about the existence of evil. Now, first of all, I would like to perhaps present what is the problem of evil. This is some of the different aspects and different questions that we are faced in this field. It can quite simply be, or at least easily be presented as the question of how can an omnipotent, all-loving God exist alongside evil. As a result, this is a challenge for the theist, but you soon notice that this is a challenge for the atheist as well. If we assume that God doesn't exist, but we know that evil exists and suffering exists, how are we meant to accommodate for that? How are we meant to live in a world with evil? That is a question that both theist and atheist wrestle with. Secondly, it seems to be a difference, as I've said, between the philosophical and pastoral problems of evil. You have philosophy, like the logical, evidential, objective problems of evil, which are arguing, well, okay, we have some evidence in front of us. Can God exist philosophically and theoretically? That's one debate. But there's also the pastoral debate of saying, all right, evil is a true question that both Christians and theists have to suffer with and struggle with. And one of the important things we need to think about is a historical development of the problem of evil. And I think the historical discussion on the problem of evil is very helpful because it separates our perspectives from our modern analytical, theoretical lenses with this more contemplative, pastoral, and meditative approach of the ancients and the church fathers. The church fathers in the very beginning of the church faced a very different landscape than we did today. Their interlocutors, the people they talked to, were all believed in God. They were theists. As a result, the idea that God did not exist was never on the table for our church fathers. Irenaeus, Augustine, Aquinas, well, Aquinas is perhaps a bit later, but nonetheless, the early church fathers all recognized that, well, we all believe that God exists, so they didn't view evil as something which would say, okay, maybe if evil exists, God doesn't exist. That was just not in their collective consciousness. It was only in the medieval to Enlightenment periods where they really thought, well, hold up a second, why do we take God as such a given? Why must God exist? Why can't we just say, well, perhaps evil just means there is no God? That idea that evil could be used as an argument against God instead of an argument to develop our understanding of God is only something which appeared in philosophy in probably the last 500 years and a bit. So that's a very interesting change. It's like, well, in the past, people just kind of accepted evil as part of life and really touched on it in a very pastoral, in a very existential way, whereas nowadays we're like, okay, there's some problem with God, let's jump ship and become an atheist. And so there's a bit of a difference within this collective consciousness of philosophy and religion in relationship to evil. And the reason why I say this is because this change of attitude, as I like to demonstrate in this session, and as I've been trying to demonstrate through this talk, is that propositions, belief in God is one thing, whereas the attitude to actually want to worship God is another thing. In some sense, ancient world was way more about one's attitude towards God, whereas these days we were kind of reduced to this idea of does God exist, does God not exist. We were reduced to this very based and very kind of simplistic, overly simplistic, I would like to say, discussion on the problem of evil. And perhaps if you want to take something away from this session, I'll be saying, well, perhaps we should move back to the ancients. They were writing thousands of years ago. Well, maybe not thousands, but maybe 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. Yet they still had this really deep pastoral meditation on evil, which I think is a way more productive approach to evil. After all, we can talk about the philosophy, theories about evil all we want, but at the end of the day, it doesn't change the fact that evil is a very real and substantive or phenomena that we all have to shape our worldview around and kind of understand what it is. So in line with this ancient and kind of this contemplative school of thought, I'd like to begin with the book of Job. The book of Job is one of my favorite books in the Bible, as I've said. It is a very unique book because in the past, or even in the modern days, we were talking about prosperity gospel in our first session, about how some people like to say, oh, if you believe in God, then good things will happen to you. You'll be rich, you'll be smart, you'll be attractive. I don't know what else they say. You might have a lot of girlfriends. I don't know what they say, right? But they'll say you get all these good things as a result of believing in God. However, the book of Job kind of bursts that bubble quite quickly by saying, well, there's a man in Uz called Job, and he was righteous and God's servant. He did everything right, but he still suffers significantly. It's a very interesting book because it asks us to re-examine and reimagine every single thing we know about evil and suffering and expectations of God. If you read the book of Job, you notice there's the prologue, where the 2 chapters where Satan goes to God and asks God to be able to test Job, and then Job suffers. You have the ending where God appears from the clouds and says, "Who is that which obscures my plans with words without knowledge?" He challenges Job for saying, "Why did you expect anything else from me? I could do whatever I want." And in between that, you have this section, that almost 36 chapters of Job's friends just showing up and saying, oh, maybe you committed some sin that no one knew about. Oh, maybe you did this, maybe you did that. Oh, maybe this sin is for something. Oh, maybe your suffering's for something. They try to explain all of this evil. Yet, at the end of the day, or at least God says to Job, well, your friends are wrong. You friends better go and repent to Job and ask him to pray for you because, well, all right, you spoke injustice on my part. You tried to speak falsity about Job, and you try to speak falsity about myself, referring to God, of course. And when you look at that, you're like, oh, okay, this is a very weird book in the Bible. It's a very strange one because, well, how can we believe in a God which would have the most righteous man in the world and someone says, oh, no one would ever rebel against you, and you're like, and then God says, oh, do you look at that guy? Test him with all you want. You could kill his family, you could take away all his money, you could do everything to him, take away his health, and he'll still worship. You look at him, and then Satan goes and does absolutely everything, and Job still worships God, and then everyone's like, well, okay, that's kind of weird, but there's something unique about this because it is in the Bible for a reason, despite how paradoxical it sounds, and in some sense, it's the clearest presentation of the problem of evil from a contemplative stance, because, well, if you think about it, everyone has sinned. We can't really be like Job and say, well, I'm righteous, I'm very good, I didn't do anything to deserve it. We've all fallen. And as a result, we can't really make the same case as Job. But Job, he could make that argument. The writer of the story really, really wants us to believe that Job could make the argument to say, well, I'm good, I didn't deserve this. But what I think is the miracle of Job is 2 things, really. Firstly, it's a denial of moral economy. And moral economy is the idea of an exchange. We live our lives based on an exchange. And this is something we talked about in the second session of this series. I do something good for my friend. I expect my friend to do something good for me. My friend gives me a gift. I was talking to a good friend I mentored in high school, and he was like, sometimes my friends or my uncles or whatnot give me a gift, and I feel very bad of accepting it because then I'll feel I'll have to do something back for my uncle or whatnot. And then sometimes I say, well, you know what? I don't think that's how gifts are working. If someone gave me a gift on the assumption that I was meant to do something back for him, then that's not really a gift. I'm just trying to bribe him or something. And I think there's something true about that. I think that's what the book of Job is trying to say. It's to say we cannot try to do good things for God with the expectation that God's going to do something good for us. We cannot say, oh, just because I'm going to do X, Y, Z sacrifice, God's going to shine X, Y, Z mercies for us. We cannot expect that form of moral economy from God. And it's very tempting to expect this because we all want to believe that good deeds equal good results when that is not really the case in this world. And you could say, well, maybe in the future we'll get good in a result, we'll go to heaven. And that's another discussion, but at least in this world, we cannot expect moral economy, both with our friends, both with the people around us in this world, but also with God. We cannot then try to control God by doing good for him, because that then changes the mentality. I think it changes the semantics of your relationship with God. So that's one thing. Job represents this denial of a moral economy. And the second thing which Job really does does in a very interesting way, is to say, well, what makes Job happy at the end of the book? You read the book of Job, Job gets everything back at the very end, but then when he gets everything back in the end and epilogue, that's just kind of almost a side statement that the writer then adds on at the back. It's almost like, oh, I've written the whole book of Job. Oh, maybe it would be nice if he gets his stuff back, and he just writes his stuff at the back. It doesn't really sustain the narrative structure. It doesn't contribute to the narrative structure. When God speaks out of the cloud saying, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. He is not giving an explanation to Job about why he suffered. He doesn't give an explanation to Job about, oh, Satan told me to test you. He gets absolutely none of that. All Job is given is the experience of God. And I think that's a very fascinating thing. I think that's something when you think about. There's this idea that all Job requires in this whole story after he's lost everything was not getting all his health back, not getting all his money back. In fact, he even says at the very start is, cursed is the day that I was born. He rather have died and not to have lived at all, but still he doesn't curse God. But despite all that struggles and suffering that Job goes through, all that is sufficient for him and all that makes him happy is that God appears to him. He is reassured by God's existence, reassured by God's presence. And in some sense, this is, in a very strange way, anticipation of the incarnation of Christ. Because in some sense, we struggle, we don't get the answer. We don't get the answer like Job. We don't get told exactly why things happen. We're finite human beings with a finite knowledge. Yet we have the incarnation in the same way that Job, all that filled Job's heart was the theophany, the experience and expression of God from the whirlwind. We also have the incarnation of Christ, who was God stepped down from earth and died for us. We get that theophany. We get God's experience in the world and expression in the world. And that is, I think, what is meant to be, at least according to Job, the solution to the problem of evil in the Bible, because now we have to accept that God's appeared for us. We need to accept his sacrifice. And like Job, that's all that Job really needed to have that miracle and belief in God, despite all the evil. Now, that's a very fascinating and quite a paradoxical claim. It's a very odd one because, as you can see, it's probably not the easiest thing to come to terms with. As much as we would like to say, okay, God's appeared, voila, everything is done, there's still that kind of gnawing kind of problem or question of, well, okay, still, why did that have to happen? And I don't think the Bible really responds or needs to respond to that, because that's where faith comes in. That's where our belief and worship of God comes in. It's that contentment with the current present situation, regardless of what's going on around us, which I think is the mystery and the miracle of the Bible. It's this very paradoxical and unique kind of experience and this unique kind of idea which just, I suppose, answers or resolves the whole situation in a very odd kind of way. It doesn't ask us or doesn't give us a solution. It just calls from us a question. It calls from us an action. We need to respond to this. Because someone could very much, and this is the brilliance of Dostoevsky and Ivan's, the Grand Inquisitor. Dostoevsky, well, not the Grand Inquisitor, the chapter before that called Mutiny, where Ivan Karamazov says to his brother, look, there's the Turks killing babies, there's the kid getting abused by his parents, and a dog gets sent to them. And he says, out of all of this suffering, I understand that there might be free will. I understand there might be necessary parts of human life. I understand everything. I even accept that there's God and eternal harmony. I accept heaven. I accept everything. That's what Ivan Karamazov says. And he says, regardless of all of this good, I will still refuse to accept God's creation. I will refuse to believe in God, regardless, even if I accept that he existed. And that's, I think, the crux of the Bible's problem of evil, and that's why I want to stress the attitude which the problem of evil asks us from us. It's not about, oh, I believe in God exists or I don't believe in God exists. What the Bible is really questioning us is, if God gives us absolutely nothing apart from his experience and his incarnation in the world, his death for us, if that's all we have, do we still choose to believe in God, or do we still choose to say, well, God exists and I reject the ticket? I reject to go to heaven because of all this suffering he allows? I think that's a fundamental question upon which all of Christianity lies upon, almost. Because in the end of the day, I've come to the strong belief that no one really comes to God or starts worshiping God because of, oh, I have this argument, I don't have this argument. It's really about that acceptance. Do I choose to worship this God? And that's really what Christianity is all about. Now, I don't want to go even more on the book of Job or talk about Dostoevsky because I know I love this topic, and this is why I do most of my research on, so I could end up rambling about this for the next 3 hours. So I probably shouldn't talk about that any further. But let's turn to what the Bible says about suffering and evil, apart from the book of Job and all of this stuff. Well, what actually is suffering and evil? Perhaps I should have done this the other way around, but I suppose I wanted to keep you in a bit of a mystery, a bit of guessing about what actually is evil and what actually is suffering. Well, suffering on one hand, everyone kind of knows, and evil, everyone seems to know, but what the Bible shows or says about evil is that evil is something introduced by man into the world. It is a result of free will. There are two big questions in the problem of evil and suffering because, well, you say, well, okay, evil exists, but that's not really suffering, and suffering exists, but that's not really evil. Example, Nazis in the Holocaust, they go attack and kill the Jews. That's moral evil. That's a moral agent choosing to do something. However, if I was walking down the hill and a rock falls out of the hill and hits me on the head and I die, well, unless a monkey threw that rock on my head, that got no agency behind it. It was just gravity, and it pulled the rock down and hits my head and I die. So it seems like suffering and evil are two different things, but the Bible really interacts with evil more so than suffering, because suffering is, as we look in the book of Job, more of an attitude. We need to respond to God as a result of suffering. We need to choose good as a result of suffering. But evil, on the other hand, is purely the result of the fall of man. Evil and free will always get are tied directly together. God loves the world so much that he gives his only one and only son, but his idea of sending the son is on the assumption that we can freely decide to follow and accept him. I hope there's no Calvinists in the room because they'll get horribly annoyed that I've said there's free will. But apart from that, I would say if God sends his son to allow us to believe in him, then, well, it naturally then follows that we must have free will to actually accept the sacrifice of Christ. And likewise, all the evil that occurs is naturally a result of that decision. The very precondition of God sending his son, the incarnation, naturally leads to all the evil which occurs, all the sin which occurs, because humans still decide to reject God despite that incarnation, that theophany, that experience of God from heaven. Now we've understood a bit of what free will and suffering and evil is, and how they're intimately related together. I would like to turn to perhaps a more theoretical problem of evil, and hopefully I'll go through it quite shortly, quite briefly. But it's important because a lot of times when we're thinking about the problem of evil, when we're talking to atheists about the problem of evil, you get a variety of the logical problem of evil, the evidential problem of evil, and the abductive problem of evil. The logical problem of evil is a priori argument of evil. It's an argument which says, let's take a step back from all forms of experience and just make the argument that if God exists, if evil exists, there's a logical inconsistency between the two. Therefore, if you accept that evil exists, God cannot exist. If you accept God exists, evil cannot exist. And any evidence of one or the other would then lead to the defeat of this whole, the existence of God or the existence of evil. And the way they go around doing that is to say, well, first of all, God is omnipotent, so he can do absolutely anything he wants. And the second thing, it says God is wholly good. And this is a very interesting assumption, and you could find this work in J.L. Mackey's work. Mackey's a fascinating philosopher and a fascinating thinker. The assumption behind this is a good being would eradicate any evil if possible. If there's any evil, then a good being would remove it. And if you accept that as an assumption, and you also accept that God can do absolutely everything, then if God is good, then that means he'll remove every single element of evil. And therefore, based on those assumptions, then they would say, well, okay, if there's evil, then God cannot exist because, of course, all-powerful good being would remove any example of evil if possible. So that's the logical problem of evil. It's just purely based on reasoning alone. There is no evidential reasoning. There's no questions of probability or anything related. Now, the evidential problem of evil is a different one. In a slightly different vein, it says evil makes it unlikely that God exists. If we have this example of evil, it is most likely that God would remove it. And they might say, well, all right, and this is the example of William Rowe. Rowe says, well, imagine a fox, a deer, well, a fawn, I guess a fawn's a deer. So imagine a deer's in a burning forest and the deer's dying for no reason. He's like, well, surely a god would have stopped that deer from dying because the death of the deer doesn't seem to impact anything in this world at all, but the deer still dies and it seems to be just a meaningless, gratuitous, unjustifiable form of evil which occurs, or suffering which occurs, and there's no explanation to it. Well, William Rowe then says, well, all right, there seems to be a lot of such examples, in the same way of Ivan Karamazov's idea of the Turks killing the babies or whatnot. It seems like there's a lot of these seemingly gratuitous evils which just don't seem to be able to exist if God existed. And therefore, from these examples, they would say, well, it's unlikely that God exists. Now, those are logical and evidential problem of evil. Let's turn to some of the more theoretical responses. And an interesting thing is the logical problem of evil has gone out of the fashion. I don't know what they call it these days. What do they call these things? A trend. If you think about philosophy as trends, which is normally quite a good way to look at it, logical problem of evil was a very big trendy thing maybe like 30, 40 years ago. Then a guy called Alvin Plantinga comes around, puts the free will defense forward, and just kicks the whole logical problem of evil out the door because they realize it's not very good anymore. And the reason why the free will defense works is because if you're making a logical argument, you could do something what some people in mathematics call a proof by counterexample. If you could provide one possible world in which God and evil coexists, then, well, the logical problem of evil cannot be correct, because then you'll have one world in which evil and God exists. Therefore, there is no logical inconsistency between them. And what they do, or what this argument is to say, well, the existence of free will is a good which is so valuable to God that free will is more important than anything else. And if you allow free will, as I've said, if you have free will and that free will leads to evil, then of course, if God wants free will, then he will allow for evil to exist. Therefore, God and evil can coexist. That's basically the bare bones version of the free will defense. And I think it is quite successful because we all intuitively, I would say, believe that free will is valuable. And most moral evil could be explained on these terms. We all would like to believe that free will exists, and we all, I think, believe that it is necessary that free will exists. If we say there cannot be any free will, then what's the consequences of that? There cannot be human responsibility. We cannot love freely. We cannot make an impact on the world apart from just being a robot and determined to actually act in a certain way. We're able to be creators as a result of the free will that's given to us. And I say that's a very important defense, and I think it's probably the best response to the existence of moral evils, because I just find the free will defense very, very, very persuasive. Now, the second argument I would like to argue, now that's a bit of a mistake. I should say natural suffering are necessary because natural evil doesn't actually exist. So that's a bit of a mistake on the notes there. But natural suffering is necessary because, well, if you're thinking about it, what does it mean for natural suffering to exist? Natural suffering is the result of the laws of nature. A rock hits me on the head due to gravity and I die. Well, if I was going to say, well, I wish natural laws didn't allow for the rock to hit me on my head, I'll kind of be saying, well, I wish the gravity just didn't act as gravity did. Or if I said the deer is burning in the fire, and I say, well, the solution to that is just to not have fire at all, then, well, how exactly are things meant to work if fire didn't exist? We need to write a completely different set of the laws of the universe in order to accommodate for such a world. Now, if that's really the case, if that's the case that all these natural sufferings are a result of the laws of nature, but we also know from last week's fine-tuning argument that if these cosmological constants, if these natures or conditions of the universe are very difficult to change, and if you change them, they have drastic impacts on the survivability of the human species, then it naturally follows that, well, we cannot just randomly say, oh, let's just get rid of all evil or get rid of all suffering in the instant by saying, oh, let's just get rid of gravity. I don't like fire, people burning, so I'll get rid of fire. I don't like this, I don't like that, and then we just get rid of all of it. Then you might not get a universe which sustains any life at all, or just it would just be a completely different universe. We might be trying to we might be trying to we might be trying to make our cake or bake our cake and eat it as well. It doesn't seem to work that way when it comes to fine-tuned universe. So it does seem to me as well that natural suffering is in some sense necessary as a result of the very laws of nature which must exist. Now, the next thing we have is soul-making theodicy or soul-building theodicy. This is the idea that evil leads to moral virtue, and this is something which I think is a very good argument. We have responsibility, And part of that responsibility and that wrestling with struggles in our life is to make ourselves better. I was watching my Instagram Reels recently, and it showed me this very interesting video. It was this priest sitting down, and he was like, well, I asked God for wisdom, and he gave me challenges to solve. I asked God for patience, and he made me wait for a long time before I reached my goals. I asked for strength, and he gave me even more struggles to solve. And in some sense, if you're a bodybuilder, you notice that in order to gain more muscle, you need to lift heavier and heavier weights. And in the same way, in order to become a better person, I would say you need to lift heavier and heavier challenges. And as a result, soul building seems to be at least quite a good explanation for why we might experience suffering. Now, some people would say, well, all right, can't God just make us all good in the first place? But I don't think that actually means anything, because if we're all good in the first place, then, well, what is the point of God creating humans? If God just wanted another God, he would just create another God and humans would not exist at all. I think there's something beautiful about ourselves improving. And in fact, if we look back at our own struggles, I would like to say, at least for a lot of people, of course, there's some instances of horrible sufferings where you're like, okay, probably that there's a bit more of a question around that. But at least if I look back at my own life, I would say, yeah, I've had some struggles in my life, but all of that's made me to who I am today, and I probably wouldn't choose to have it any other way. And I think that's really the case of soul building. And of course, some people say, well, why care about soul building? What's the purpose of virtue? Why can't we just be happy? But I would say that's a very hedonistic kind of view of things. And if we view happiness as the goal of the whole existence of the universe, then we'll be acting in a very different way, which I think most people would find a lot of questions with. If you think I just want to pursue pleasure as the only key in my existence, I think most people quite quickly will find that world somewhat repulsive. I wouldn't want to make a sweeping statement out of it, but I would say most people would find that suggestion quite counterintuitive. And as a result, I think soul-making too is quite a fascinating response to the problem of evil, and at least there is very good intuitive evidence to say it builds character and makes us better people. So that is some of the responses to these theoretical problems of evil, but there is still the question that we began with, the pastoral problem of evil. How do we choose the attitude towards Christ? And I think this is something which I would like to leave this to you, and really you can decide to do what you want with it, because at the end of the day, I can't really provide a response to pastoral problems of evil, because it is ultimately a pastoral question. I could provide you all the facts you want, but you need to make the decision. And in some sense, this is the reason, and this is like kind of the culmination of all these talks, is to say, well, we are given a world with some good and some evil in it. We can decide to do good, or we can decide to do evil and add to the good or the evil in this world. But in all of this experience and all this struggle, we need to recognize that we have to make a decision. And that decision lies in the pastoral problem of evil. You can be like Ivan Karamazov, who says, if all the suffering in this world is necessary for this good, I would prefer to just reject this creation entirely. Whereas at the same time, you can say, well, I see all this suffering, I see all this evil in this world, and I'm going to still decide to worship God. This is an open-ended question almost, the pastoral problem of evil, to say, well, okay, how are we meant to respond to the existence of evil? And that is all our decisions and all of our burdens.